everybody, and welcome to the Aggieville Alleycats podcast, where come rain, shine, or anything in between, we're here to deliver to you the Kansas State sporting news that you so love. I'm Ace Edwards, right alongside
Connor Baltazar.
And after a rough one last week, luckily we get a team that, full disclosure, not the greatest team in the world, and that is up against the Baylor Bears. We're just going to dive straight into it with their stats from last year. Offensively, they were a 6-7 team last year, 4-5 in conference. Ended up losing to Air Force in their bowl game. Ran for 2,371 rushing yards, 4.4 per attempt with 34 rushing touchdowns. Passed for 3,009 yards, 7.68 per attempt with a 63% completion percentage. 9 passing touchdowns to 11 picks. A third down percentage of 40.22, which is actually quite good. A red zone touchdown percentage of 71 and a scoring percentage of 80. 22 sacks allowed, 32.15 points per game, and 418 points for. So they were a pretty balanced offense last year, if, a touch unremarkable at times. 4.4 yards per carry and 7.68 yards per attempt in the passing game. Neither of those are eye-popping. Those are pretty much what you would definitionally call below average.
Yeah, and that kind of goes with their 6-7 record. I mean, they were a fine offense at times, actually pretty good early in the year, but there was a pretty sharp drop-off once Shapen got a concussion earlier in the year, and after that, their offense was just never the same. And pair that with an inexperienced receiver core, and you get a very average at best offense.
Yeah.
But that takes us into the defensive stats from last year. They gave up 26.85 points per game for a total of 349 points against them all year. They gave up 2,896 passing yards on the season and 17 touchdowns through the air. And then rushing yards, 1,927 yards on the ground at 25 touchdowns. Red zone percentage, they gave up a touchdown 66% of the time, and then a score 90% of the time. And then they had 13 interceptions, 11 forced fumbles, at 24 sacks as a defense, and their turnover differential was +1.
Yeah, so solid enough, not necessarily through the air, but their rush defense was pretty all right. In terms of who they're bringing back from last year, they're bringing back Blake Shapen, their quarterback, bringing back Richard Reese, one of their running backs, and then Monterey Baldwin, who was their leading receiver last year, brought back Matt Jones, who is third in tackles, Garmin Randolph, who is their tie for sack leaders, and then Gabe Hall, who's their defensive lineman, who is also a tie for a sack leader, and then Devin Lemiere, who's a safety, who was second on their team in sacks last year. So a lot of what they're returning is kind of on the, it's a lot of ties, but you still have a lot of different, it's up and down, we'll say. We'll say it's up and down in terms of what they brought back, but consider what they lost.
Yeah, they lost a ton from last year's team. A lot of guys that were integral to their Big 12 championship back in 2021. We'll start with literally the biggest, Siaki Ika, their nose tackle. He was drafted in the 3rd round by the Cleveland Browns. He was a massive problem for the Big 12 and was a really, really good nose tackle. They also lost their left tackle, Connor Galvin, as an undrafted free agent to the Detroit Lions. They lost Gavin Holmes, wide receiver, another undrafted guy, this time the Titans. Ben Sims, undrafted tight end to the Vikings. They lost Christian Morgan, their interception leader from last year, as a safety, another undrafted free agent to the Packers. And they also lost Squirrel Williams at running back. He transferred to Louisiana Tech. They also lost Micah Mazuka. I can barely read it.
Yeah, it's Mazuka. My fault.
The guard, they lost him as a transfer to Florida, and then they also lost Lorando Johnson and Al Walcott. Both of their corners transferred to Arkansas. And then their linebacker, leading tackler, really, really good defensive player, Dylan Doyle, he graduates. So they lost a ton this offseason. And after already having a bit of a letdown season in 2022, They didn't bring back as much for 2023.
I think that's a pretty good read of it, is that they already weren't the greatest team last year. But now we can get into their 2023 schedule and who they've played. As we mentioned before, well, we haven't mentioned it yet, they're a 3-6 team, 2-4 in conference. They had a pretty bad opening to the season, which was a loss to Texas State, 31-42. Go Bobcats, by the way. Lost to Utah, 13-20. Ended up beating Long Island 30-7. Got washed by Texas 6-38. Barely escaped UCF on a massive comeback where UCF just kind of ran out of gas at the end, 36-35. Got washed by Texas Tech 14-39. Barely escaped Cincy 32-29. Was beat by Iowa State, not necessarily horribly convincingly, but 2 scores, 18-30. And then lost to Houston in overtime, 24-25. So I guess their marquee victories would be considered UCF.
Yeah, and the thing is, even with that was a pretty fluky win.
Yeah.
They were down significantly at UCF, I think at least 21, and they came back to win that, and they had to get some help from UCF really allowing them back into the game. And so, Baylor's technically not lost a road Big 12 game this year, but it was a fluky comeback against UCF and a narrow win against a very bad Cincinnati team. So I don't really know if that's it's a bit of a misleading statistic. I've seen it thrown around a little bit. They haven't lost a road game in the Big 12 yet. It's not that simple. Technically, yes. Yeah. But it's not quite that simple. This is a Baylor team that has really struggled and taken a step back. It's kind of unfortunate because we're kind of Dave Aranda fans over here, despite, I think at the beginning of the show, we were not Dave Aranda believers. And the first year of our show was Dave Aranda going to win the Big 12. And so then after that, we became believers, and all of a sudden he's coming crashing down to earth, which is kind of unfortunate for him. It shows how quickly a program can fall, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But you have the opening offensive stats.
Yeah. So as we already said from the schedule, they're 3-6 this year, 2-4 in conference play, 1 loss away from being shut out from bowl eligibility. So they have that on the line. They have 1,026 rushing yards in the year, a miserable 3.4 yards per attempt, 2,495 passing yards for 7.25 yards per attempt, 9 passing touchdowns to 6 interceptions and 11 rushing touchdowns, and an offensive third down percentage of 38.06%. Not particularly impressive offensive numbers.
There's nothing about that that's impressive.
I was trying to be nice, but you are right. It's pretty bad. Those rushing numbers especially are atrocious. 3.4 yards per carry in college is just bad.
Yeah, no, that's abysmal.
Yeah, which is especially strange given the complement of supposed talent you have at running back. That may be more of an offensive line issue than anything. At least it should be.
Yeah. Yeah. But on defense, their third down percentage is 43.22, so they're not getting off the field consistently on third downs either, which is so strange for a Dave Aranda coach team. They're only averaging 22.67 points per game, 204 points for, 265 points against, a turnover differential of +5 with 16 sacks on the year. And this is another team that struggles in the red zone. 61% touchdown rate on defense and 77% score. And on offense, a 41% touchdown rate and 74% score. They are not scoring in the red zone.
Yeah, they aren't scoring anywhere, really, it seems. But that touchdown rate in the red zone on offense, I'd say it's a new low, but we did just see a team that was worse in the red zone, technically. But that's pretty abysmal. All-time bad numbers, it seems, the last 2 weeks for red zone touchdown percentage. It's pretty bad.
Yeah. Before we get into the scouting report, here is a quick word from today's sponsor. And welcome back to this episode of the Aggieville Alleycats, going through the Baylor Bears and the scouting report for them. Before we get into the scouting report, if you are enjoying these episodes, we take a lot of time to make them, so if you could be so kind as to leave a review on the show, it helps spread the show out. You know, more people can listen to us, which means that more people become knowers of ball, among other things, but we would really appreciate it in all seriousness. So let's just dive straight into their offense. See, this is a very strange Baylor team, just top to bottom. Just to show our hand here a little bit, this Baylor team does not have an identity. And I mean that seriously. Like, there's no bit of irony, there's no joke to that. This team does not have an identity anymore. 2 years ago, they had a very, very clear identity. They wanted to run the football. They wanted to be the physical team that was going to beat you to hell on offense and defense. And it worked for them. Last year, they tried to kind of stick to that identity. This year, it's completely gone. And that's sort of reflected in their run-pass splits. They're running the ball only 42% of the time. 58% of the time, they're passing the ball, which, if you would have told me a Dave Aranda coach team was doing that 2 years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But in the running game, they certainly have evolved past their more pure wide zone phase, which they had 2 years ago. But they still notably do have a preference for zone running, getting their linemen up on the move. A big part of that is sort of their play action game, which even they've moved away from that too, which it's just so strange watching this team, like how they've developed and gone away from their core identity. They're running play action 26.05% of the time and running screens 17.25% of the time. So it's such a strange mix for a team that had such a definite plan of just a few years ago. And even last year, you could argue that they had a pretty solid and consistent plan. You knew what they were going to do on a game-to-game basis. This year, it just kind of seems like they're mid at everything, so they don't have any one thing that they're particularly great at. But that sort of leads into the conversation about their quarterback, who, he may not be wedged into any particular offensive scheme, but if there's one word to describe Blake Shapen, steady.
Yeah, there's not much else to say about him really than that. If you look at his PFF grades going back to when he first started playing, his first action, I think, was against K-State back in 2021. He's pretty much the exact same quarterback. And that's not with any exaggeration, really, on my part. He's continuously been, I think you said it well, steady presence. And he's fine. He's a fine quarterback. He's not going to make a ton of mistakes. But when he does make them, they generally will come in bunches. And he isn't often making the huge risky throws that pay off. He's going to take what the defense gives him. I'm using a lot of stereotypes right now, but he's kind of a stereotypical quarterback. That's kind of Blake Shapen. He's a little bit undersized. He's a little bit scrappy. He's a gamer. Deceptively fast. No, he's not really deceptively fast. He's not very fast at all.
But he's moderately fast. I think the biggest thing about him is he does have pretty good arm talent.
Yeah. Ace and I were talking about this before the episode, and he kind of feels like the embodiment of like a COVID-era quarterback recruit where they tear up a 7-on-7 ball where they aren't facing pressure and they can make all the throws in the world, but they just cannot operate under pressure at all. His PFF grades are stark between when he's kept clean and when he's under pressure. And he's under pressure over 30% of the time. His PFF grade when he's kept clean, 87.3. That's a fantastic grade. But under pressure, that drops all the way down to a 50. So he is I think he's the perfect embodiment of that sort of quarterback. A quarterback that can make incredible throws and has really great arm talent, but they aren't really made for live action in some ways. At least they don't play like it all the time. But Shapen's a good QB. He's not bad. He's experienced. But he's another middle field merchant, believe it or not. He has a significant majority of his throws happening over the middle of the field. Short center's 28% of his passes, intermediate center 17.5%, behind the line of scrimmage is 16%, and that's all center. Everything else, if you go outside the numbers, the most attempts he has anywhere outside the numbers is short right, so inside of 10 yards and beyond the line of scrimmage. He has 12 there. Between the numbers, short, he has 61 attempts. So he is living over the middle. I imagine he's a mesh/slant boy. And,
Michael Thomas.
That he is. But he's still a good QB. He'll make the right read more often than not. He's a good college quarterback. You can't just sit back there and wait for him to make like a bevy of mistakes more often than not. You're going to have to get pressure on him. You're going to have to be aggressive with Blake Shapen. If you just let him take what the defense gives you, he could dice you up. We saw him be pretty effective at times against K-State back in 2021. And that was coming off the bench cold. Not as much in 2022, but I think that was not entirely a Blake Shapen problem. So
that was a Baylor problem. Yeah. So Blake Shapen, like you said, he just kind of strikes me as the ultimate fine quarterback. That's sort of how I would describe him. Is he will consistently be like an honorable mention worthy Big 12 quarterback, and that's it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you also have to have the supporting cast to kind of support those quarterbacks. I'm going to tell you something right now, they don't. Their lead two running backs are the Oklahoma State transfer, Dominic Richardson, and then Dawson Pendergrass, alongside Richard Reese from last year. Richard Reese from last year has seemingly, like, he's not the lead guy anymore. That honor belongs to Dominic Richardson. But it really is just sort of these three guys. They all are remarkably similar, except for Dawson Pendergrass has 5 touchdowns. But starting with Dominic Richardson, he's pretty similar to the player we saw at Oklahoma State the previous year, which means that he is certainly a fine running back. He's a fine running back with a little bit of twitch, a little bit of speed, maybe just a touch of power. He has a little bit of everything, but nothing that you're going to particularly say, wow, that's an elite back right there.
Yeah. I think that's a fair way to put it. I mean, he's averaging a little over 4 yards per carry, and he is decent up the middle. That's where he's going to run most of his plays, at least an A-gap. He's pretty good, averaging 6 yards a carry or per attempt. He's got 114 yards there, but everywhere else is just kind of a grab bag of, just how effective is he going to be or not. And a lot of that can be skewed by, like one long run. So he's ultimately a decent running back. I think it's really interesting that Dominic Richardson usurped Richard Reese, because last year Richard Reese, as a freshman, was nearly a 1,000-yard rusher and had 14 touchdowns. He had a fantastic freshman campaign.
He was just a hammer. He would just hurt you.
Yeah, which is so weird because he's like 5'9", 180.
Yeah.
But he looks like he's like 6 foot 230. But Dominic Richardson kind of taking over for Richard Reese is an interesting storyline to track. There's some backstory there that we're not aware of. Because, the running back room has, I guess, been a little bit tumultuous because Quaylon Jones was dismissed before the year even began, and Quaylon Jones was a big part of that backfield last year. So Dominic Richardson, he was very take it or leave it for me when we saw him last year when we faced Oklahoma State. Mm-hmm. And his, at least his stats, his grades, his tendencies aren't shouting to me like much has changed in that regard. But I'm still interested to see what he can do.
Yeah, he grades out to be a slightly above average running back on PFF, 69.5 for his offensive grade. Then you move on to his running mate, which would be Dawson Pendergrass. He's above average, and I believe he's a true freshman, or at least this is his first playing action. He has a 73.8 grade, 80 in the running game. Yeah, you want to talk about hammer? He's kind of taken that he's sort of taken that and ran with it. With 20 missed tackles forced on him, which that's just breaking a lot of arm tackles, which makes sense given he's 6'2", 219. He's also averaging he's averaging 3.5 yards per contact per attempt, which is very good. But he's also just not like the big home run hitter, weirdly enough. He only has 5 runs this entire year of over 10 yards, and that's on 60 attempts. So that's not what you want. But he's also the guy that they're probably going to hand the ball down at the goal line to. With a lot of off tackle guard running, listen, man, they would just want him to bolt through people, and he's strong enough to do it, if a little bit unremarkable in terms of his speed.
Yeah, he's kind of a weird case, It's he's got the best average per carry on the team. He has about 20 fewer carries than Dominic Richardson. But yeah, he's kind of a little bit tall for a running back. But yeah, he's a bit of a touchdown vulture, I guess, down at the goal line. But I don't really have a lot to say about Dawson Pendergrass. I think his name is kind of funny, but
that's a great name. No, it really is a great name.
But it's he kind of came out of nowhere. I'm a little bit surprised as someone that has not followed Baylor super closely this year. It's a little bit surprising to not see Richard Reese kind of be the bell cow back on the squad. Now, for what it's worth, Pendergrass, his snap counts have gone up the last couple of weeks compared to Dominic Richardson. Richardson still leads in rushing attempts by 22, but Pendergrass played a lot more snaps the last couple of weeks. Richardson saw a decrease in his snaps the last few weeks, so maybe that's the signs of a shift.
Troubled waters, perhaps?
Perhaps that's it. But I'm not really sure what to make of this whole situation. I still think it's really weird that Richard Reese isn't the guy. But that isn't up to me, I guess.
Yeah. Now we can talk about the receiving room, it's another example of it's just a receiving room that doesn't have this definitive this is the guy. It's just a bunch of people who have potential but just don't really execute on it the best.
If that was supposed to segue to me having something intelligent to say about these receivers, I don't really know what that would be, because all these guys are fine. Monterey Baldwin last year, I thought that he was an interesting weapon that seemed kind of underutilized in some ways, and he's taken a slight step back this year, at least in terms of his grades, but he's still playing fine. He's, again, pretty undersized. He's 5'9", 170, so he's about the same size as Phillip Brooks, at least on paper, but he's probably more slight than Phillip Brooks, which is not a good thing to be.
Nope.
But Baldwin's the leading receiver by about 200 yards. He has 3 touchdowns. He's pretty good. He's a good receiver. He, again, lives over the middle of the field. He's pretty effective behind the line of scrimmage, over the middle, and also between the numbers and the intermediate range. He isn't as great on the outside, but he's not completely ineffective on the outside. He's fine. He has some fairly good grades deep and also some good grades intermediate, but again, getting over 25% of his targets between the numbers intermediate.
Yeah, he's pretty much your prototypical slot gadget guy. And, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just who he is, and that's who he's always going to be as a 5'9", 170 receiver. But he does have legit speed and athleticism with which to make you pay if you're not paying attention. But it's the other two receivers that just kind of strike me as the ultimate sure kind of guys. I mean, you have Keyshawn Jackson Jr., number 11, 6'3", 208. That sort of size profile would make you think that he's a contested catch receiver. And no. He's averaging like maybe 25% contested catch percentage, not what you want from a true alpha. But what he is he's a pretty effective deep threat again. So the name of the game here is sort of like a Sunbelt. It's sort of like a Sunbelt receiving core where a lot of it's just, you're banking on athletes and deep threats to just make the team go. But Keytron Jackson, his best grades is deep left. So like I said, deep threat. 93.5 deep left grade. But everything else past that just shows a lot of, being okay. Again, intermediate center. That's not really his game, but it's where he has the second most of his attempts, right next to short center. But his deep percent, he's going deep. According, per PFF, he's deep 30% of the time. So Keytron Jackson is definitely the deep threat of the group, which means, again, he has speed and he could be used as a legitimate, gadget option. And mix that with his size, he's someone who has the potential to be legitimately dangerous if used effectively. But then you got the last one, which is Josh Cameron, 6'1", 217. Fine. He's another example of just a guy. And I typically don't like using that phrase because I don't think it's particularly helpful. So when I do use the phrase, I mean it in a very literal sense that Josh Cameron is just a guy.
Yeah, he's fine. There's only really one other notable receiver. That's Hal Presley. He's fourth in receiving on their team, but he doesn't have any touchdowns. 17 catches on the year, so somewhat similar to Josh Cameron. But, I mean, those guys are pretty solid fill-in guys for the 3 and 4 spots. But there's just... it's one of the more unremarkable receiving cores that we have faced this year, which... frankly, of the receiving cores we've faced this year, this is probably the one that's closest to ours.
I'd say Jace Brown makes the difference for K-State.
He just might, but it's an interesting core, but they're not bad at all. They're just, it's definitely a bit of a tonal whiplash given the core that we faced last week against Texas.
Yeah. Defensive backs may be bored. I don't know. Because we're not going to get dusted by A.D. Mitchell or Xavier Worthy. But they also have their tight end. He's been here for 85 and a half years, and that's Drake Dabney. You don't know his name because Ben Sims was in front of him for all of those 87 years. But he's fine.
Yeah, he's their third leading receiver. 347 yards on 23 receptions. He's got 4 touchdowns. He's pretty solid. He's a pretty standard tight end in that he likes to work over the middle. He's got some big catches over the middle, 2 touchdowns over the middle, but he does have 2 drops, so his drop rate over the middle is 33%, which is not great. But he still is fairly decent. His deep left grade, which I imagine is just where Shapen is most comfortable throwing the deep ball, is fantastic. 3 catches on 4 targets for 98 yards. It's a 94.5 receiving grade there. But he's just not as utilized as some of the other guys in terms of pure targets. But he does a lot of work short within 10 yards. That's where the bulk of his targets are. Nearly 40% are going to be short over the middle.
Yep. And he's an alright run blocker, too. Alright, now we get into their offensive line, which... there is exactly one person on this offensive line who has... Wait, let me verify. There is exactly one person on this offensive line who's played the same position every single week. The offensive line sucks. They're giving up pressure on 35% of dropbacks, which is really, really bad, which I think is sort of why they keep shuffling people. But the one person that has remained consistent is Alvin Ebiselli, or Ebiselli, I believe, 6'6", 300, and he's a pass-blocking left tackle who can't run block, which, again, I always say if you're going to pick a skill set for a left tackle to have, you would absolutely take him as a pass blocker, and he's good at that. He's a little, I don't want to say he's slight at 300 pounds, because 300-pound people could probably eat me, especially if they're 6'6", But, he's, for a left tackle, that's not necessarily anchoring position, not necessarily anchoring strength, but he does well enough against pretty much all types of rushes, except for, weirdly enough, against Utah. Utah ate his lunch for some reason. UCF, he didn't have a great game either, but the one thing he just can't do is he can't run block effectively. 48.6 run blocking grade on the year, which... Yeah, and here's where the fun begins. Here's where everything starts shifting and no one is happy. Listed at center, but actually their left guard these last 3 weeks, is Clark Barrington. 6'5", 308. And he's another example of someone who, weirdly enough, is graded out pretty well. I'm going to tell you right now the PFF grades are lying, except for maybe about his pass blocking ability. Because while he doesn't deal with big people just right in his face, which is why I think he moved away from center, he's actually pretty effective at pass blocking. But again, when he's going up against a defense with a pulse in the running game, he's just not doing it. And the PFF grade disagrees. I disagree with the PFF grade, and I think I'm right. Because if he was doing perfectly well at where he was before, he wouldn't have moved. But, Connor, do you want me to keep riffing, or do you want to cover the other fun adventures that is every other offensive line position changing?
No, please continue. You're doing pretty well.
Thanks, man. But then you have their person who will probably be playing center, and that's Colton Price, 6'2", 307. This is the first time in my life I've ever seen a 0 pass blocking grade. Granted, it was up against Texas in relief, so maybe we won't have that against him. But again, he's just an inoffensive and probably a little bit inexperienced center, given that he seems to be a more natural guard. And this entire lineup just really confuses me, because it seems like you have natural guards playing center, you have natural tackles playing guards, and the only position that you don't really have is I don't think they have a natural guard playing tackle. But, well, that may change. But yeah, Colton Price is inexperienced but inoffensive is the best way I would describe him. Campbell Barrington started off at left tackle, moved to right tackle, and now is right guard. Sure, he's a BYU transfer, and he was a pretty good tackle at BYU, granted in limited snaps. But he was pretty solid there, so what happened here? It's the same problem everyone else on this offensive line has. He can't pass block. Or he can't run block, rather. He's a decent enough pass blocker, but I just don't think he has the chemistry necessary with his offensive line yet. Plus, he has a similar problem to Ibisele, who he's just a little slight at 6'6", 297, which for an interior guy, I guess you'll kind of take, but it's not really what you want. So, and he's just, again, they all keep moving around so much, which means the staff thinks there's something wrong. I agree, but PFF just seems to disagree with the metric there. Then finally, you get Gavin Byers, a name that is familiar to us because he was their right tackle last year, right alongside Connor Galvin. 6'5", 312. He's fine. I think at this point he's probably a little underrated, but again, he's moved. He started the year as left guard, wasn't doing very well there, then moved to right tackle, and oh wait a minute, he's suddenly much better at right tackle. Nothing about this offensive line makes sense. And I think a lot of their problems have to do with the fact that they just don't get one another yet. Or they may not ever get one another. Because if it's not one point of failure, because they're all graded out pretty well in pass blocking, but are giving up pressure on 35% of dropbacks, something's got to give here. Something's not adding up.
Yeah, really, really weird offensive line. I don't really know what to make of it other than there is a lot of youth on that line. Byers is a senior. We're familiar with him. He's been around. And Barrington as well. He's a senior too. But other than that, Ebisele, he's a freshman. Price is a freshman. Who was the other one?
The other Barrington, Clark.
But yeah, he is a senior.
So both of the Barringtons are seniors?
Oh no, the Campbell Barrington. Oh, I didn't realize there were two. He's a junior, but they're still two true freshmen. It looks like trying to make their way around, and yeah, we've seen this year. We've heard from K-State this year that it does take a while for offensive lines to gel and to get comfortable playing at the same time. So they have to just get reps and get used to it. So that could be part of the issue with this Baylor squad. So, I'm not going to sit here and say they won't figure it out against K-State, but they haven't shown much evidence that they will. I'll put it like that.
Yeah. Now we move in to their defense. It's still the Aranda 3-3-5, which means that you're going to get a lot of match coverage and a good amount of blitzing. That's basically what an Aranda 3-3-5 is. Occasionally they do walk up a linebacker, but again, that's Aranda 3-3-5. But you can start with their interior defensive line, which is Gabe Hall and Cooper Lons. Gabe Hall is a familiar name from last year. Lons less so. But yeah, again, what do you say?
Yeah, he at the very least is not grading particularly well. And for 6'6", 287, he isn't defending the run as consistently as you would expect. And he's also not the best tackler. Again, this is all what PFF is saying. So they're up and down. We'll put it like that. We'll be nice to them. But Gabe Hall, yeah, he is familiar. He's a senior now, and he's been playing for Baylor since 2019, or at the very least, he's registered a stat every season since then. He had 4.5 sacks last year, has 2 this year, but he hasn't had one in a few games, so maybe he's due, but hopefully not. He's a good interior offensive lineman. He's no Siaki Ika, and he's not even close to being Siaki Ika, but he's fine. He's a pretty solid guy. He has the build of a run stopper interior defensive lineman. Not necessarily an anchor, but just given his height, I don't have him penciled in at least as a furious rusher of the passer. He did, of course, register sacks last year, but he's not getting sacks at some high clip or anything like that. But he's all around a pretty solid player. He's not bad. He supposedly played a little bit of coverage according to BFF, or at the very least he's been graded for it, even though he's not listed as having snaps for it. He's got 18 pressures on the year, no hits, just a lot of hurries, but he's fine. He's a good defensive lineman.
Yeah, someone who's just kind of relentless and keeps going forward no matter what. But then you have Cooper Lons, number 97, 6'3", 278, who's listed as playing a lot of nose tackle. I'm going to tell you something right now. A 278 nose tackle is Hayden Gillum's dream because he's not 340 pounds. But he's just another pretty average guy who plays way bigger than his size in terms of run defense. Grading out pretty well in run defense, but he's just not going to rush the passer. He has a single sack on the year and then 5 total pressures. Yeah.
So if Gabe Hall's not the pinnacle of pass rushing, then that's just even more true for Cooper Lons. So he's been allegedly on a bit of a roll the last couple of weeks in the run defense game, but it's been pretty consistently ineffective for the most part in the pass rush this year for him.
Yeah. Just not much of a factor in terms of pass rush, but plays way bigger than he actually is in terms of run defense. So a lot of that just means that he's willing to try. Because a lot of run defense is being willing to try and just giving it your all. So congratulations, Cooper. But then you get their 2 edge players, TJ Franklin and Byron Vaughns. The TJ Franklin is the true edge, which was you'd consider to be like a true defensive end. He's been here for 5 years, so we're familiar with him. We're familiar with his game. He's defensive number 9. He's a pretty good pass rusher, and that's his job. His job is to rush the passer at 6'5", 268. So he has 24 total pressures, only 3 sacks, but 19 hurries, though. And granted, you take a look at who those hurries were against. It was a Texas State squad that's in the Sun Belt. Pretty good Utah offensive line. 2 against Long Island. 1 against Texas. 0 against UCF. 0 against Tech. 2 against a really bad Cincinnati squad. 3 against an Iowa State offensive line I have no faith in. And then 5 against a pretty bad Houston offensive line. So he's he's playing better against worse competition, who'd have guessed. But it's not like he's getting completely decimated when he's going up against, better competition. But that being said, he has a pretty good, I seem to remember him having a pretty good outside move, like a pretty good rip. He's a pretty nice finesse rusher despite his size. But, he's just another example of a pretty solid 3-3-5 quote-unquote defensive end where, he's just going to get you consistent pressure. And that's it.
Yeah. He's got prototypical size. There's not really a lot to complain about with TJ Franklin. PFF doesn't like his tackling, but PFF is super inconsistent with how they grade tackling.
PFF doesn't like anyone's tackling.
Yeah, so it's hard to really say one way or the other. But the other edge rusher that they have is Byron Vaughns. As opposed to TJ Franklin, Vaughns is listed as a linebacker on the rosters on ESPN. But Vaughns, he's been a bit of a journeyman himself. Another fifth-year senior, maybe sixth. Spent 2019 with Texas, where he did play at 14 tackles, and then didn't play 2020, and then transferred to Utah State, where he was really effective for 2 years, and now he's back in the state of Texas with Baylor. He's got 3 sacks on the year. Just had one last week against Houston. He had 2 against LIU Brooklyn. I'm not going to draw anything from that. But he's got 14 pressures on the year, and it's been kind of feast or famine for him most of the year. He's had a few games with 0 or 1, but he's also had several games with multiple. Utah, he had 4. Houston, he had 3. He had 2 each for Cincinnati and Iowa State. And his hurries have also been somewhat inconsistent. In the middle of the schedule, he just kind of took a break from doing anything, it seems. Just didn't have any pressures at all against UCF or Texas Tech. Didn't have any against Texas State either. But also his snap count has been a little consistent as well. Only 16 snaps last week against Houston compared to the week before, having 29 against Iowa State. He's gotten as low as 10, which is weird that in his game with the fewest snaps, he had 2 sacks, but okay. So,
as you do.
Yeah. So he's been around. And after spending a couple years at Texas and a couple years at Utah State, he's back at Baylor. But he's a pretty solid edge rusher at the end of the day. Another guy with good size. He's 6'4", 238. That's another thing you just can't really teach. And he is a solid pass rusher. He was really good last year at Utah State, and the pass rush. He had 35 pressures last year. Not on pace to meet that this year, but still having a pretty solid season.
Yeah. Now you move into their linebackers, who's good old reliable Matt Jones and then Brooks Miller. Matt Jones is the epitome of an average linebacker who's not particularly good in coverage. And this year his tackling has taken a step back as well. He's missing 15% of his tackles, which and he's even regressed in coverage as well. He's giving up a reception on 74% of his coverage snaps, which means that if he's in coverage, he may as well just not be. But, he's a heady player who's going to consistently be in the right spot. That's about it. He kind of reminds me a lot of Blake Martinez for the Packers and Giants, where even if he wasn't like the most consistent tackler purely, he was still going to rack up a bunch of them. But he's also really knowledgeable, so you can tell he's like the captain of the defense. Marcus Calhoun, captain of the defense. But he's the guy who directs everyone where to go, and a lot of that is because he's been here since, like I keep saying, he's been here since the year 1912. So Matt Jones is just the epitome of steady Eddie, fine linebacker. If this was the 1980s, he would probably be an all Big 12 linebacker.
Yeah. Moving on to Brooks Miller, another linebacker. He's only played in 5 games this year, and one of those games he did not play a lot. So he's really only been playing, truthfully, as the starter since week 8. Week 6, he still played 35 snaps. But the sample size isn't really there to draw a ton of conclusions on Brooks Miller. He's a good linebacker. He's a junior. He's been around for a little while. He's in his 3rd year with Baylor. But again, this year, he's just not really done a whole lot. He's missing his tackles 16% of the time. Suboptimal.
Yeah,
I guess.
suboptimal.
Yeah, he's allowing a reception 70% of the time. Again, suboptimal. Not as suboptimal as Matt Jones, but still not great. He only got 2 pressures on the year. That's just not his game. But he's fine. He's really fine. He isn't, again, phenomenal, but we still haven't seen much of him this year. Really only, again, 3 games of 50-plus snaps and only played in 2 others. So he is just fine. I really don't have a lot to say about Brooks Miller just because there's just not a lot to say at all about Brooks Miller. PFF doesn't like him particularly much, but they don't really like many, I guess.
No, they don't like a lot of people.
Yeah. And before we get into the corners, I would like to take this opportunity to say that Baylor has a freshman corner named Reggie Bush.
Good job, Reggie Bush.
He doesn't play. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. But now we can get into their corner room, which is headlined by Caden Jenkins. He's a really good corner. He's probably like the thing that, other than Matt Jones, that gives the defense any sort of identity, which, as you can tell, we've said throughout the episode, we said it at the very beginning, this team has no identity whatsoever. But Caden Jenkins is a big part of it because he's consistently sticky and he knows his match coverage assignments, which is so strange considering how young he is as an outside corner to know all of those assignments so well. But no, he's just really sticky. He's only giving up receptions on 44% of his balls that come his way, with 3 picks, 1 pass breakup, and a 37.3 passer rating allowed against. So, he's a legitimately good corner, albeit a little bit undersized at 6'1", 166. So he may get blown over by a slight breeze, but he's really sticky, and he's going to be another corner that you probably don't really want to throw his way unless you have someone who can just body him and create separation that way, because it's going to be very difficult for you to shake him in a more traditional route running sense. Yeah,
I mean, probably the most impressive thing about Caden Jenkins is that he's a true freshman.
Yeah.
I think, or at the very least, he's a redshirt freshman. But this is his first year playing. He's listed as a freshman, and he's been really, really good. So he deserves a ton of praise for that. But that takes us into their next corner, Chateau Reed.
Great name.
Fantastic name. Like House Reed. Mansion Reed, I think.
Mansion Reed.
But
Mountain House Reed.
Yeah, he's 6'2", 194. PFF would have you believe that he's either the greatest tackler in the world or quite literally the worst tackler that's ever walked the face of the earth. That tells me the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. And he's been fine this year. Relative to Caden Jenkins, I'm not sure how I would compare those two necessarily. He does have a pressure on the year. He just had a pressure last week, I should say, against Houston. But he does have good size, 6'2". He's filled in the frame a lot better. That makes sense because he's a junior. And he's in his 3rd year in the defensive system. Notoriously difficult system Dave Aranda has. He's got an interception on the year, has a pass deflection, 19 tackles for him on the season. He's pretty good. Baylor does have two athletic corners, so Chateau Reed, maybe not as much of like a highlight guy as Caden Jenkins, or at the very least not as notable, just because Jenkins, being such a young guy, that's makes it even more impressive what he's doing. But Chateau Reed, allowing a passer rating of 104.2, suboptimal, some might say. But I'm giving it 12.7 or 108.9, excuse me, I read that incorrectly. 13.8 yards per reception, 61.9% of the time he's giving up a reception. So he's certainly the cornerback ever.
Yeah, he's fine. He's a fine corner who's going to give up more catches than he breaks up. But I think that's just a part of his play style and the fact that he's just so close, like, to everything. Then you get into the safety room, which is Devin Lemiere and Devin Bobby, and then Corey Gordon Jr. Starting off with Lemiere, because he's the familiar voice. You may remember him as the guy who got sent to the Shadow Realm by Deuce Vaughn, or one of many who got sent to the Shadow Realm by Deuce Vaughn. He's taken a big step back from last year. I think we may have broken him. But last year he was second on the team in interceptions. This year he has yet to record a single interception. In fact, he has yet to record a single pass breakup. And he's giving up receptions on 56.3% of times that he's targeted. And an 86.2 passer rating against. He does line up pretty consistently as the free safety and the center fielder, and I just don't think he has the speed and athleticism for it. Whereas last year he was lined up somewhat consistently as more a slot/strong safety guy. This year he's playing a lot more free, and you can tell it's just not necessarily his natural position. And yeah, he looks out of place as a center fielder because he just doesn't have the sideline to sideline speed, which you really need if you want to be running like a true center fielding defense. But then you get O'Connor. You have good old Devin Bobby here, who looks pretty good.
Yeah, he's had a few really gem games this year. Texas Tech, he had a fantastic day. But Devin Bobby's a sophomore. Last year he played some, but this year he's really come on strong. 57 tackles this season, 2 pass breakups, forced fumble, and a pick. So he's doing pretty well. He's 5'10", 187, so a little bit undersized for a safety, but if you're a good safety, you're never going to let that stop you. Yeah. But his missed tackle rate, 6.2%, fairly decent.
That's good.
Yeah, it's 4.2 yards per reception he's allowing. 81 passer rating is what he's allowing as well. Allowing a catch 58.8% of the time. That's nothing really to write home about here. The 81 passer rating is it's better than his compatriot in the all-name team, Chateau Reed, but different positions. But he's mostly played free safety this year, at least according to BFF. 3 games, they say, at strong. But tackling, again, PFF, very inconsistent with this, it seems. But they really like him in the tackle department. But
he doesn't miss tackles very often.
Yeah, so he's grading out pretty well this year, 73.8, so he's well above average. And a good run defender, too, 84 grade on the season. Especially impressive given his frame of 5'10", 187. But Devin Bobby feels like a really good name for a safety. Devin Bobby.
I agree. Then you have Corey Gordon Jr. This is his first really big year playing. He's going to play their jack/star position. And he's graded out okay, although he hasn't been considered a starter in these last few weeks. His snap count's sort of going down. But when he has been playing, he's been pretty consistent. Although he is missing 18% of his tackles, he's doing really well, or pretty well, in coverage given the circumstances with three pass breakups. And a lot of the passer rating stuff, like 118 and 70.4 in terms of receptions, a lot of that is just, he doesn't quite know the match assignments yet, which he's a young slot corner / jack / star. So he's just not quite there yet.
Yeah, he's a true freshman trying to learn a very important position in a notoriously very difficult defense to learn. So not the position I'd want to be in if I were Corey Gordon. Because, this was the position that Jalen Petrie played a couple of years ago, and he's been starting for the Texans for 2 years now.
And he's been quietly one of the best players on that defense.
Yeah, he's been very, very good. So not a position I would envy of Corey Gordon.
Yeah. So now we can go into the stories to watch going into this game. First and foremost, can K-State stay motivated after a pretty demoralizing loss last week, as well as the potential for Arlington, I don't want to say completely slipping away, but functionally it's no longer in your hands?
Yeah, I think so. That's been a very consistent part of Chris Kleiman at K-State is K-State plays pretty well after losses. So we, especially this year, I think we bounced back pretty well. And I think that this is a really good opponent to get the week after getting Texas, because they're not a pushover whatsoever, but all the advanced stats would say that Baylor's overmatched. But I don't think motivation is going to be an issue.
No.
Does Colin Klein call a good game against a still pretty complex defense?
Trick question. Most of the people on the defense don't understand the defense. That's how complex it is. So, yeah, I would imagine he plays a pretty good game.
Yeah, and it was a great game last year against a similar defense, against the same defense. So I think that Colin Klein's going to be just fine.
Yeah. Next up, can K-State's defense keep Baylor in a state of just not having an identity?
I don't know if the defense is going to need to do that. I think Baylor's doing just fine on their own, not having an identity. I don't think we need to step into the picture and accidentally mess anything up. We'll let Baylor construct their own demise.
Yeah.
But can K-State establish their run game this week after struggling last week?
Yes. That's it. That's all I gotta say. Like, their defensive line and linebackers are not that great.
I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, I don't either. Which receiver keeps up the momentum from last week, given that we saw the semi-breakout of Keegan Johnson? Jace Brown kept up a little bit of his momentum. And, of course, Phil has been sort of the steady Eddie guy on the plays where he decides to put forth efforts.
Yeah, I'm rolling with Jace Brown this week.
Yeah. I think I'm going to go with Keegan Johnson. I think that we're going to make a concerted effort to say, okay, Keegan, like, you showed us a little bit last week. Let's see if you can do it again against a defensive backfield that outside of one really, really good corner is just kind of okay. But that leads us into offensive and defensive MVPs. I'm going with the dueling Wills. That's Will Howard and Will Lee.
And then offensively, I'm going with Jace Brown, and defensively, Jake Clifton.
So before we get into score projections, this team is not good. Like, they're just not a particularly good team. Advanced metrics say it. The eye test says it. They barely escaped UCF with a victory because UCF decided that it was going to crap down its own leg. But this is not a good team. And if we struggle with this team, I will be massively concerned. But the thing is that I just don't think we will. Because this is a team that, although they are fighting for bowl eligibility, it's a team that doesn't have a consistent, solid identity. I think the Cats donkey roll Baylor like 42-10.
I have 52-10. I think Colin Klein is going to be out for vengeance after last week. He's been very vocal about wanting to hit 50 points. So I think he finally does it this week.
Yeah. You have any final thoughts?
If this game is remotely competitive, I might melt down for the first time in my life.
Yeah, I don't blame you. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up this episode of the Aggieville Alleycats podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. If you want to follow or contact the show, you can follow us on just about anything at Aggieville Alleycats. If you want to email us, we're AggievilleAlleycats@gmail.com. If you want to follow us on a more personal note, I am at ACEdward00.
I'm Matt Connor Baltazar, capital C, capital B.
And if you want to support the show financially, please be sure to check out the official Aggieville Alleycats merch store. Link in our Twitter bio and the podcast bio. But most importantly, thank you all for listening to this episode of the Aggieville Alleycats podcast. Where come rain, shine, or anything in between, we're here to deliver to you the Kansas State sporting news that you so love. Stay safe, Alleycats.